This game is actually a lot harder than Dark Souls, but it's for all the wrong reason. Now, it's hard not to compare this to Dark Souls initially because the game is clearly inspired by From Software. If anything, you can consider this Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2 in Unreal Engine 5, and you can just call it a day because that's really what it is. But I think Lord of the Fallen has done some really good things here, which is to make a Souls clone that's actually good in some areas. No, it is additionally trying to add its own spin on things, and that's where I respect it. Specifically, the whole Umbral overworld. That's really cool, the fact that you can switch between worlds, but at the same time, it feels like a gimmick. No, there is fun to be had in this game, and I understand that there are many people complaining about it, which, makes sense. There are some glaring issues. I think this is one of those games that is actually better if you wait a bit until the game has some patches under its belt and it's a bit more refined, right? But in the future, when most of these issues are fixed, this will be a really good game. Sadly, some of these problems are built into the game itself, such as the story. I don't think they can really fix that, but it's still a fun game nonetheless. No, the original Lords of the Fallen, I haven't played it. I saw the game and I understood that it was just a cookie cutter RPG. It wasn't really worth me playing it. Other people may have liked it, but I'm not one of them. In checking the reviews on Steam for this game, just to satiate my curiosity, they weren't that good. Even though Lords of the Fallen and Lords of the Fallen, they're both named the same game, it's set in a different time. And I think that this is where they should have actually moved away and actually named the game something different as opposed to Lords of the Fallen, because this is supposed to be a sequel, but at the same time, having the name being the exact same, I don't think that's a really good way to go about things. Now, they could have made Lords of the Fallen 2 and simply did what they did before and just made a sequel, but they decided to take a complete pivot and go the Souls route because they saw an opportunity. And the opportunity was the fact that there were Souls players that wanted more games. And Elden Ring, the DLC, isn't out yet. So this is a very good period for them since there's no other competition in the Souls area, right? I like that initiative, but the game still feels like a crude copy rather than being inspired by Dark Souls. This game has adopted aspects from the From Software series of games. Specifically, they're trying to, utilize the game design. No, what they missed here was the philosophy. It has the feel of an older RPG game, which makes sense because that's what they made before, an old school RPG. Now, this could be a transitional stumbling where they're trying to make a new game using a new engine and a new gameplay style, and they're still not 100% clear on how to do it yet. So this feels like an MVP, right? A minimum viable product, where they're trying to see if people would actually be interested in this kind of game, and thus they can move on and make another game. Hence why I think they changed the name, so it's kind of a reboot. Then in Lords of the Fallen 2, hopefully, I think that they'll have their own philosophy, their own gameplay system, and they'll make it more of their game as opposed to a copy of a Dark Souls or a copy of a From Software game. That's what I'm looking forward to in the future. Now, some of the issues with the philosophy that we can see with this game is the fact that the bosses, they're big and forgettable. And this is something that is plagued in the old school RPG genre, where most of the boss fights, you're not going to remember them. They don't stick with you because they're not really important to the story. They just feel like cutaway bosses that you can toss out of your memory. They're not really that important. If you've already played the game, you'll understand what I mean with the final boss. It's just a boss of exposition, literally exposition the boss. Now, only one of the bosses, in my opinion, really hold any weight for the story, and that's the first boss you actually fight. The angel chick, I forgot her name. Is it Pieta? Yeah, Pieta. I think that's her name. Maybe it's not. No, in Dark Souls, when you compare it, there's actually a world where these bosses have their lore sprinkled around, right? So it's not like you go and you fight the boss and that's it. You'll actually hear their escapades, their interactions with other people and creatures in the world. So they actually have a presence in the world as opposed to just being a boss. The next point is the fact that the story itself isn't really captivating or engaging it, but there isn't really any weight to it. It doesn't feel important, doesn't feel interesting. It's not engaging or mysterious. It just feels like nothing. I barely remember what it is, right? The endings were of no significance, really. I went through and watched all of the endings on YouTube. They're not really worth it. Feels like a waste of time, honestly. But the game itself is fun. Like playing the game is fun. So they captured the gameplay, just not the story. There's something that they incorporated with the game where when you beat a boss, you'll have the opportunity to actually get like a standstill 3D dreamlike look of some major event that happened in the boss arena. But I really didn't care about that. It sprinkled, that sort of thing is sprinkled throughout the world of Lords of the Fallen. The atmosphere and the audio doesn't really resonate with me personally. And it seems like other people share that experience. There are a few that I like the way weapons sound. I like the way they sound, but some enemies don't have footsteps. And when you use the pyro mechanic in this game, it doesn't have any weight to it. It feels like you grabbed an item as opposed to parry an attack. I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't really feel fair telling you that, hey, this game is fun combat, but at the same time, going through the game does feel tedious. The game has some elements that are just frustrating, such as the ranged enemies seem to do a lot more damage than they should. I'm not sure if this is what they intended, but ranged enemies can really take like 1/3 of your health in one shot. And some of these enemies can fire off multiple shots in quick succession. So it feels like you're at a disadvantage, especially with the fact that the enemies can actually lock onto you long before you lock onto them, right? They can lock onto you at a further distance than you can lock onto them. And in some cases, they'll actually see you before you see them. So it feels like you're at a disadvantage. And even when you run out of the range of a ranged attack or a ranged enemy, they can still attack you and you don't know where it's coming from, really, right? There are many situations in this game where you're gonna get ganked, straight gangbang action, and it's not fun. You'll be fighting one guy thinking that, you know, I got some room to work with, but no, there's somebody else there behind the bushes, behind some, you know, boxes and stuff. I know you gotta fight like a whole army of enemies. It's really a lot. So much so that it feels like the enemy placement was placed to be arbitrarily difficult as opposed to the enemies themselves being difficult. Because in Dark Souls, learning the enemy's pattern was a part of the difficulty. But in this game, the enemy patterns are pretty easy to learn. There's not much variation. So it's not really anything difficult to deal with. But the sheer number of enemies that you deal with, that's what makes it difficult. Now, in the Umbra world, it looks really nice off the get-go. And the novelty is at its peak right there for this game. But then it quickly wears off at the mid-game point. Because in the Umbra world, you will consistently have enemies appearing and you have to fight them, right? Problem is, you don't hear them. There isn't like a distinct enough sound effect for you to hear when enemies appear. And I don't believe enemies have footsteps here. Or their footsteps are so light that it's hard to actually perceive them. So while fighting enemy A in Umbra, 2 more enemies will appear and they'll either shoot you or creep up on you. No, they don't move super fast, but they move fast enough that it causes an issue. Maybe they wanted to do it that way so that way you have more sneak attacks in the game, but it feels a bit cheap for me. It doesn't feel like it was a fair interaction, in my opinion. The final point that I would like to add here in terms of the tedium is the fact that there's so many enemies that can be packed together in one area that it simply doesn't make sense to fight them. It doesn't make sense to run away. But additionally, those enemies can have umbral parasites attached to them and they can buff the enemies in 2 ways. One is to make them invincible to damage, or 2, it allows them to heal up immediately after you damage them. So it makes sense to get rid of them first before fighting. But because the enemies are so densely packed together, you'll have a group of, let's say, 6 enemies, and they're all connected to one parasite. And the parasite is hidden far behind the enemy. So you're going to have to dodge into the enemy's line of fire, shine your lantern on the parasite for a few seconds, and then wait for the parasite to blow up, and then you can start fighting. You're set up for failure right there, in all honesty. So it makes more sense to just bypass that and don't even deal with that. So there are aspects of the game where it makes more logical sense not to fight than to fight. visages is also another issue for me. You have two types of visages. You have the main story visages that you can just use for free, but you also have an umbral visage that you need to use an item to access. No, the placements of these visages is really strange. You go through long sprints where you won't have any visages. You'll finally find one, but you need to use an item, right? So you use the item, but then like 2 minutes down the path, there's an actual free visage for you to use. That doesn't work out fairly to me because it feels like I'm forced to use a resource. It feels like a waste of a resource. And granted, these items are limited. I think you can only have 99 of them per run. Putting these different visages so close together, it feels unfair. It feels like it was placed there arbitrarily. I don't know. I'm not sure what they went for here. I can't really make heads or tails of it. Besides, it's just a bad way to interact with things, or it's a bad way to develop things. Now, this game does a few things right, and I think the appearance and the graphics is something that they're really done right. Especially like the way the armors look and the way the world looks. Like those things, they really, man, hats off to the designers. You guys did a fantastic job of the world design and the armor design. No, the problem is the game feels a bit more tedious when you're fighting, so you don't really feel that you don't feel that allure to really take in the environment. Because after you finish with a combat interaction, you're just like, all right, I'm done with this. Time to get out of here. Fuck these guys. That's really what it feels like. I need to get out of here as quickly as possible, as opposed to beating the enemies and being like, wow, that was fun. Look at this stage. This is nice, right? You don't really get that much time to appreciate that because you always need to be on with regards to your situational awareness, just in case something is behind you that you didn't notice, something is ahead of you, or there's an enemy in the distance taking shots at you. So there isn't really that opportunity given to you to appreciate the environment. It feels like most of the weapons have the same animation. It's just a different weapon being given the same animation. So it feels like they made one weapon or one weapon archetype and simply made different skins for all the weapons as opposed to giving them unique animations. There are some issues with the appearance. Like the character creator isn't really that good. I never really dude, this is like this is one of the disappointments of the game with regards to the appearance. The character creator is really bad. It's not even, I honestly don't even worry about creating a really good looking character because the facilities aren't there for that. You're gonna spend a lot of time trying to make something that looks cool. No, just make a derpy face, I guess. I guess the developers were looking into the fact that in FromSoft games, people just make these grotesque looking characters, so they gave you the opportunity to make grotesque looking characters. I guess. I don't know. I didn't really like it. There's nothing really there for me. I like to make somewhat good looking characters. I usually play games without the audio on, unless they're like a competitive game, such as Apex Legends. But for this game, I wanted to make the exception and actually like immerse myself in the game and experience what it had to offer. And this game, what I was offered in terms of the audio was not an offer. It wasn't that good. The game is better experienced with a podcast in the background for me. The audio effects weren't like stimulating, they weren't interesting, they weren't important. They didn't really add more to my gaming experience. I'm not missing anything here. For example, the parry sound. If you listen to the parry sound of Dark Souls compared to this, it's a big time difference. Maybe they didn't have enough of a budget for audio professionals. Instead of just talking about what I don't like in terms of the audio, I do like the way certain attacks sound when they hit the enemies. I really like the ping of the hammers when they hit an enemy. So that was a good choice. Now, first of all, this game is actually fun in terms of combat. There are issues with some bugs, and they can be as bad as the internet says it is. But not all the time, let's be fair, right? This developer, I think they're very good at putting out patches to fix these bugs, and they're putting them out at a pace that I've never seen AAA games go this hard at patching their game. The game was playable on release for me. Other people had issues though, so your mileage may vary. I gotta tell you that. No, as it goes for the multiplayer, I don't care about the multiplayer. I didn't test it. I honestly didn't play it because I understood that multiplayer was not going to be available in a comprehensive state or a useful state of launch. So I didn't even bother to go into it. I personally don't play these games for the multiplayer, but some people do. Sadly, it's still having issues. So avoid it if you don't have to, if you don't want. If you don't want to play it and you don't have to, then leave it be. Now, one major issue for me, and I think this is hard coded into the game itself, is the lock on system. The lock on system is very unreliable. It locks on to the furthest enemy from you. There are some cocoons in the game that have the possibility of hatching an enemy, and the game will lock onto that as opposed to locking onto the closest enemy or the next enemy. And you're gonna find yourself struggling and fumbling to lock onto the correct enemy. Now, as it goes for this specific issue, the lock-on issue, I'm willing to extend an olive branch here under the understanding that it's actually a difficult issue for the developers to fix, but they're actually working on fixing this issue. It's just going to take some time. As it goes for fixing the bugs, they've earned my trust on that front. And I think this being a minimum viable product, and I think it's a success as a game goes. They're going to learn more about how to develop games using Unreal Engine 5, and they're also going to learn more about what it is they want to make in a game, right? I think this is a great learning opportunity for the developer, which is Hexworks, right? But Hexworks, I think they're going to be learning a lot from this game. They're going to be learning how to fix issues, and these issues won't be an issue in their next game, hopefully. And that leads me into what's needed for the future of this game company. I think they need to focus more on the animations and sound effects. So this will provide them the opportunity to learn a bit more as to what is actually needed in a game to immerse a player. What is needed in a game to give them proper audio cues, such as with the parrying and listening around for enemies. Because at this point, you got to keep spinning your camera around. Additionally, it would be good if they added more weapon animations for the different weapon varieties that they have, as opposed to using the same weapon animation across the board. I think this is a great opportunity for them to learn. I think finally I would say that they should refine the combat system and the lock-on system. I think that goes without saying, and they're going to be able to build out a better combat system in the future. I'm actually very interested to see what Lords of the Fallen 2 will look like in the next few years. I think this is a pretty good game. Great attempt at making an RPG with the FromSoft formula, but I think they missed the mark on it being their game, right? It feels more like they wanted to make Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2 in Unreal Engine. Overall, I think this was a good attempt at a Dark Souls inspired game, but it feels like the Unreal Engine was pulling the majority of the weight when it comes to the graphics and how well the game looked. If you really like the Dark Souls 1 jankiness, this game will scratch that itch for you. And it will be somewhat endearing to some people, especially the fashion aspect of the armors. I think the armors are done really well. They're really nice to like mix and match, and they look high fidelity. They look really good. But the game does have quite a few issues. It will be I'm not saying it will be based off of hope. I'm saying it will be a really good game in the next 2 to 3 months, given the amount of patches that this company is putting out. They have garnered my trust as a consumer, and I can't wait to see what they come with in the future. This game is pretty good, despite the issues.